For 26 years, Howard Sanders believed the official story. His older brother, a young private, simply got lost and succumbed to the elements during a routine training march in the forests of Pennsylvania. But when a timber company felling old-growth pines discovers his brother's dog tag swallowed by the bark of a massive oak, a story of a simple tragedy begins to unravel. The tag wasn't on the ground where a lost man would fall. It was deliberately hung on what was once a sapling, a silent witness to a crime that has been hidden by the forest for over 2 decades. It's a story that forces us to wonder if the deepest secrets can ever truly be buried. If you find yourself captivated by mysteries like this, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that uncover the hidden truths of the past. The chalk dust settled on the cuffs of Howard's shirt as he finished writing the last question for tomorrow's history quiz on the blackboard. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon in October of 1960, and the bell had just dismissed the last of his students. He enjoyed the quiet moments after school, the scent of old books, and floor polish filling the empty classroom at Northwood High. On his desk, next to a stack of ungraded essays about the Great Depression, sat a small, framed photograph. It showed 2 boys squinting in the summer sun, a lanky teenager with a protective arm around a much smaller, gap-toothed kid. Howard and Roland. The photograph was one of the few things he had left of his older brother. For most of Howard's life, Roland had been more of a ghost than a memory, a name spoken in hushed tones by his parents, a source of a quiet, lingering shame they never knew how to process. The official story, delivered by a grim-faced officer in 1934, was that Private Roland Sanders, just 18 years old, had become disoriented during a grueling training march in the vast Allegheny National Forest and had simply vanished. They searched for weeks, but the dense Pennsylvania wilderness kept its secrets. The Army concluded he had perished from exposure, a tragic but not unheard of accident. But the unspoken assumption, the one that clung to his family like a damp chill, was that he might have just run away, that the tough city boy couldn't handle it and had deserted his post, shaming them all. His parents went to their graves carrying that weight of uncertainty. Howard, who had only been 10 at the time, was left with a faded photograph and a hollow space where an older brother should have been. He was tidying his desk when the school secretary poked her head into the classroom. "Howard, you have a phone call. It's a sheriff somebody from a town in Pennsylvania. Says it's important." Howard felt a prickle of confusion. He didn't know anyone in Pennsylvania. He walked to the school office and picked up the heavy black receiver. "This is Howard Sanders." The voice on the other end was gravelly, measured. "Mr. Sanders, my name is Sheriff Walter Davis from Warren County, Pennsylvania. I'm calling about a Private Roland Sanders. I believe he was your brother." Howard's grip tightened on the phone. His heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. "Yes, that was my brother. He died during training back in '34. "Well, sir, that's why I'm calling. We may have found something of his." There was a pause, and Howard could hear the faint crackle of the long-distance line. A logging crew was working a tract of land deep in the National Forest this morning. They took down a big, old oak, and when they were processing the trunk back at the mill, they found this. The saw blade hit it. Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. "It's a military dog tag, Mr. Sanders. The name on it is Roland Sanders." Howard felt the floor shift beneath his feet. After all this time, a piece of him found. His tag, but how? Where? "That's the strange part, sir," the sheriff continued. "It wasn't on the ground. It was inside the tree. The loggers said it looked like it had been there for a very long time, with the wood just growing right around it. We had to cut a piece of the trunk out to get to it." Inside the tree. The words didn't make sense. A man gets lost. He falls. His belongings scatter on the forest floor. They don't get embedded 2 inches deep inside solid oak. The story his family had been told, the narrative he had accepted for 26 years, suddenly felt as thin as old paper. "Mr. Sanders, are you still there?" Yes, I'm here," Howard said, his voice raspy. I don't understand." "Neither do we," Sheriff Davis admitted, "which is why I thought you'd want to know. A man doesn't lose his dog tag inside a tree by accident." A new, unwelcome feeling began to bloom in Howard's chest, pushing aside the familiar, dull ache of loss. It was a sharp, urgent sense of purpose. The ghost of his brother was no longer a distant memory. He was a question demanding an answer. I'm a teacher, Howard said, his mind already racing. I can leave tomorrow. Where can I find you, Sheriff? The drive to Warren, Pennsylvania was long and solitary, giving Howard too much time to think. He replayed the phone call, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. Inside the tree. He tried to imagine how it could have happened. Had Roland, in his final moments, tried to leave a message? Had he hammered his own identification into a sapling, knowing it would one day tell a story? Or was it something else entirely? He arrived in the small, sleepy town nestled in the foothills of the Alleghenies and found the sheriff's office in a modest brick building on the main square. Sheriff Walter Davis was a man in his late 50s with kind eyes that had seen too much and a handshake as solid as the oak trees in his county. He led Howard into his office and unwrapped a small cloth bundle on his desk. There it lay, a tarnished, rectangular piece of metal, still fused to a rough chunk of wood. The name was faint but clear. Roland Sanders. The mill gave it to us just like this, the sheriff said softly. They said the chain on their saw kicked back so hard it nearly broke the operator's arm. Never seen anything like it. Howard reached out and touched the cold metal. It was real. A tangible piece of his brother's last day. You said this was far from any regular trails? About as far as you can get, the sheriff confirmed, pulling out a large topographical map. He tapped a location deep within a swath of green. The logging crew was clearing an old access road here, but the tree itself was a good half-mile from even that. The foreman told me they noticed remnants of an old, overgrown path nearby. Not on any of our modern maps. An old path? A forgotten trail. Did the Army search this area back in '34? Howard asked. The sheriff sighed and leaned back in his creaky chair. According to the old files, they searched everywhere. But this is big country, Mr. Sanders. If you don't know exactly where to look, you can miss anything. Sheriff Davis offered to take him to the site. They drove in the sheriff's patrol car, leaving the paved roads behind for gravel, and finally for a muddy track that was barely a road at all. They parked and walked the rest of the way. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. After a 10-minute walk through the dense woods, they came to a clearing where the logging operation had scarred the landscape. In the center was the massive stump of the oak, its rings telling the story of a life that had spanned well over a century. This is it, the sheriff said, gesturing to the stump. Howard stood before it, trying to imagine the scene from 26 years ago. A young Roland, tired and scared, alone in this vast wilderness. He walked around the stump, his teacher's eyes scanning the area. He saw what the logger had mentioned, the faint indentation of a long-abandoned trail, nearly reclaimed by nature. It was barely visible, a ghost of a path. This trail, Howard mused aloud, where would it have gone? Hard to say. Could have been an old hunting path or a shortcut from the military's training grounds. Those old maps are probably collecting dust in an archive somewhere. The idea took root in Howard's mind. He needed to see those maps. He needed to know who else was on that training march with his brother. He needed to talk to anyone who was still alive. Back in town, Sheriff Davis helped him get started, making a few calls to the county records office and a nearby military archive. A few days later, a thick manila envelope arrived. Inside was a copy of the official report on Roland's disappearance and, more importantly, a roster of the men in his platoon. Howard spent the next 2 nights in his motel room, cross-referencing names, making calls, and hitting one dead end after another. Most of the men on the list had passed away. Others had moved with no forwarding address. But one name stood out, listed just above Roland's: Captain Arthur Miller, the platoon's commanding officer. A quick search of public records showed that an Arthur Miller had retired from the Army a decade ago and was living just 2 towns over in a small community called Sheffield. Howard felt a jolt of nervous energy. This was his first real lead. The next morning, he drove to the address he'd found. The house was a small, unassuming cottage with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. An old man with a thin, bitter face answered the door, leaning heavily on a cane. His eyes were pale and watery, but held a sharp, suspicious glint. "What do you want?" he grumbled. "Mr. Arthur Miller?" Howard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "My name is Howard Sanders. I believe you were my brother's commanding officer in 1934, Roland Sanders." The old man's face, already grim, seemed to harden into a mask of stone. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed instantly by a look of profound annoyance. "Sanders," he muttered. "Yeah, I remember him. Scrawny kid from the city. couldn't keep up. What about him? His dog tag was just found, Howard said, watching the man's reaction carefully. Arthur Miller simply stared back, his expression unreadable. So? Animals probably dragged his body off. Happens. It was found inside a tree, Captain, Howard pressed. It seems it was hung on a sapling that grew around it for the last 26 years. For the first time, a visible reaction. Arthur Miller's pale eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and the hand gripping his cane went white at the knuckles. He seemed to shrink back from the doorway. That's nonsense, he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. People see what they want to see. Your brother got lost. He was weak. End of story. But the tree was nowhere near the official route of the march, Howard persisted. It was on a forgotten trail. I don't know anything about that, Miller spat, his hostility now palpable. He began to close the door. You should leave the past alone, Mr. Sanders. Some things are better left buried. The door clicked shut, leaving Howard standing on the porch with a racing heart. The old man was lying. His fear was as clear as the autumn air. He wasn't just a forgetful old veteran. He was a man guarding a dark secret. Howard now knew for certain that his brother hadn't just gotten lost. Something had happened on that forgotten trail, and Arthur Miller was right there when it did. Driven by this new conviction, Howard went to the local library and spent hours poring over old newspapers from 1934 and 1935 on a microfiche reader. He was looking for anything related to Captain Miller or Roland's platoon. Deep into an article from late 1934, months after Roland had vanished, he found it. A small piece mentioned that Captain Arthur Miller had been the subject of a brief internal investigation regarding the handling of his platoon's payroll and supply funds. The investigation was quietly closed, citing insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Howard's mind. He remembered a letter Roland had sent home just a week before he disappeared. It had been full of the usual bravado of a new recruit, but one line had always seemed odd to his parents. Roland had written, "Something isn't right with the books here, Pop. Guys are getting shorted on pay. I think I'm going to talk to Captain Miller about it next week." At the time, they dismissed it as a simple mistake. Now, it felt like a death warrant. Howard drove back to the sheriff's office with a knot of cold certainty in his stomach. He laid out everything for Sheriff Davis. Miller's terrified and hostile reaction, the old newspaper clipping about the embezzlement investigation, and the chilling final line from his brother's last letter. Sheriff Davis listened patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Howard was finished, the sheriff nodded slowly. "I think you're right, son. This is more than just a coincidence." He pulled out the old military maps they'd requested. They were yellowed and brittle, but the details were still clear. He spread them out on his desk next to the modern topographical map. For an hour, they traced the official route of the 1934 training march, a long, looping path through the forest. Then, the sheriff's finger stopped on a faint, dotted line that branched off from the main route. It was labeled Old Logging Spur. It wasn't on the new maps. The line ran for about 2 miles before dead-ending, and right near its end, the sheriff made a small X. Based on the logger's description, he said, "Your brother's dog tag was found right about here." The old trail was a shortcut, but a shortcut to nowhere. It was a secluded, dead-end path, the perfect place for something to happen unseen. "And look at this," the sheriff said, his finger tracing the contours on the map. Right next to where that trail ends, the map shows a steep drop, a ravine. They had to go back. This time they went with a purpose. Armed with the old map and a new sense of direction, they found the overgrown logging spur without much trouble. The path was nearly impassable, choked with thorny bushes and fallen trees. It was clear no one had used it in decades. They followed it for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the forest pressing in on them. Finally, the path opened into a small, rocky clearing. And there it was. The massive stump of the oak tree stood like a lonely monument. "This is the place," Howard said, his voice barely a whisper. They looked at the old map again. The ravine should be just a few dozen yards away. They pushed through a thicket of rhododendron bushes at the edge of the clearing. The ground suddenly fell away in front of them. It was a deep, narrow ravine, its sides steep and rocky, its bottom choked with a thick carpet of leaves and debris that had accumulated for decades. It was almost perfectly hidden from view. "If you wanted to hide something out here," the sheriff said grimly, "this is where you'd do it." Howard stared into the shadowy depths, his heart pounding. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his brother was down there. The next day, Sheriff Davis organized a small search party, including 2 of his deputies and a team with ropes and excavation tools. Howard insisted on being there. He watched as the men carefully lowered themselves into the ravine. For hours, all he could hear was the scrape of shovels against rock and the low murmur of their voices. Then, a call came from below. "Sheriff, you better get down here." Howard's breath caught in his throat. He and the sheriff made their way down the treacherous slope. At the bottom of the ravine, under a shallow layer of dirt and rocks, they had found him. The remains were skeletal, but scraps of an old army uniform still clung to the bones, and next to the skull lay a small corroded piece of metal, a bullet casing. With the discovery of the body, Sheriff Davis now had enough to act. They drove straight to Arthur Miller's house, this time with 2 patrol cars. The old man answered the door, and when he saw the sheriff in his uniform standing next to Howard, the color drained from his face. "Arthur Miller," the sheriff said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need you to come with us to answer some questions about the death of Private Roland Sanders." In the sterile interrogation room at the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Arthur Miller's bitter defiance finally crumbled. He sat hunched over the table, a frail old man haunted by a lifetime of guilt. At first he tried to deny it, but when Howard presented him with Roland's final letter and the sheriff described the body they'd found in the ravine, the fight went out of him. He began to talk, his voice a dry, cracking whisper. The story tumbled out, a confession 26 years in the making. He had been stealing from the platoon fund. Small amounts at first, but it had grown. He had a family. Debts. He told himself he'd pay it back. Then, Private Sanders, a quiet but observant kid, had noticed the discrepancies. "He came to me on the march," Miller rasped, refusing to look at Howard. "Said he knew the books were off. He was going to report me. He was a good kid. Followed the rules." Fearing disgrace, a court-martial, and prison, Miller panicked. He told Roland he knew a shortcut and led him off the main trail onto the old logging spur. When they were deep in the woods, far from anyone else, he pulled his service pistol. "He begged me not to," Miller said, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't see another way out. I shot him." He pushed Roland's body into the ravine, covering it with whatever rocks and branches he could find. Then, in a moment of cold calculation, he decided to create a story. He took Roland's dog tag and hung it on a small sapling nearby. He figured if it was ever found, it would support a theory that Roland had deserted, leaving his identity behind. He then rejoined the platoon, reporting that Sanders had lagged behind and must have gotten lost. He never imagined that the small oak sapling would grow, slowly and silently, for 26 years, its bark flowing over the metal tag, protecting the truth until the day a logger's saw would finally bring it to light. A month later, Private Roland Sanders was buried with full military honors in the family plot back home. The simple headstone that had stood for years as a memorial was replaced with a proper one, bearing his name, rank, and the date he died serving his country. The word "missing" was finally gone. Howard stood by the grave, watching as the honor guard fired their salute, the sharp reports echoing in the quiet cemetery. The shame that had been a silent member of his family for so long had been lifted. In its place was a profound sadness, but it was a clean, honest grief, no longer tainted by the poison of uncertainty. He had found his brother, he had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, he had finally brought Roland home. If you were in Howard's position, would you have been able to forgive Arthur Miller in his old age, or do some crimes transcend the possibility of forgiveness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you're moved by the search for truth, no matter how long it takes, we invite you to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates that justice has no expiration date.